and welcome to the Campus Technology Insider Podcast. I'm Rhea Kelly, Executive Editor for Campus Technology and your host. One unintended impact of the pandemic in higher education is the strain that remote work and learning has put on IT security. Decisions made out of necessity in the heat of the moment to preserve the continuity of teaching and learning can potentially put campus networks and data at risk. To learn more about these security challenges, as well as evolving threats like ransomware, I spoke with Stephen Heath, Chief Information Security Officer for Intrinium, an IT and security consulting and managed services company. Stephen works as a virtual CISO for a wide range of colleges and universities and has seen the pandemic's effect on IT security firsthand. Here's our chat. Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So to start, could you maybe give a little background on yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for a cybersecurity company called Intrinium. We're a national company. I do what's called virtual CISO for a lot of different organizations across the country and a lot of different verticals. And one of them happens to be higher education, which is kind of why I think I'm here today.
That's right. So based on what you've seen with the colleges and universities that you work with, how has the pandemic impacted cybersecurity in higher ed? How are they balancing that sudden need for all things remote with the need for data and systems to remain secure?
That has been obviously a big challenge for the organizations. Basically, when you have a situation where things just changed almost overnight, and this isn't even unique to higher ed. Everyone suddenly had to be able to get access remote. Everyone had to be able to have a remote workforce. It's almost like we took the timeline of people moving to remote work and fast forwarded it by about 5 years. Even though the technology was there, people weren't quite ready for it. Now suddenly they were. It's been trying to balance the two has been a real struggle because you have a lot of pressure on the IT folks and on the security folks to make things happen and make them happen yesterday. So they're getting asked to make sure everything's opened up, make sure we can have access, make sure we can do this. but also do it securely. And sometimes that second point, unfortunately, falls down as a little bit lower priority until with the intent of, well, we'll fix it down the road, and then down the road doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some examples of common mistakes institutions might make in the heat of the moment that come back to haunt them later?
Well, one of the big ones that I've seen is companies opening up or remote desktop protocol or any other remote access, just opening it up wide open to the internet and letting people have easy and quick access to their desktop computer or to the network in general. That is generally not a good idea. It's best to have some other technology to be able to do it securely. And unfortunately, in some cases, people opening that up has led to some pretty big ransomware attacks and some data breaches and everything along those lines, unfortunately.
So when say an IT team really needs to implement some IT security tools, or they need to get buy-in for spending on IT security, what kind of messaging do you think works best during this time?
It absolutely is talking about the risk, and the risk to the organization is if you can quantify that in terms of like dollars and how much of an exposure you're going to have. I mean, for instance, putting together a secure access method for an organization is going to be a heck of a lot cheaper than having to deal with a ransomware event. And that's both in terms of the amount of lost productivity, the lost time, the lost everything else. And these organizations, at colleges, your primary mission is to teach students. And so anytime that you're not able to perform instruction or do any of those things, that's a big deal. So if you can quantify in terms of not necessarily even dollars, but in terms of lost productivity, in terms of lost time, and say, this is the risk that we're exposing the organization to, and here's what we can do to fix it. Sometimes that argument becomes a little bit more balanced, and they're able to see it. And more importantly, along the lines there is that when you're dealing with people at that sort of executive level, particularly, just all across the board, they're used to the concept of risk. So it's a little bit easier to explain to. It's almost like you're starting to speak their language as opposed to the IT person who, unfortunately, we have a tendency to do the sky is falling and wave our hands in the air that something is really bad is going to happen. It's better if you can quantify it. Oh, this is our top risk. This is a medium risk. This is where this lands. This is where this lands, and we really recommend that we do this. That can be a compelling argument, and I think sometimes that can break through that executive barrier that a lot of times the cybersecurity initiatives die at.
So when you look across higher education, and there's such a wide variety of institution sizes and varying levels of IT maturity and IT resources, what kinds of challenges does that create for IT security?
Oh, it is really tough because you've got situations where you've got the haves and the have-nots, and unfortunately, the basic reality is that the student data at the haves is inherently more secure than the student data at the have-nots, and that creates an equity problem between organizations. So, I think largely that's something that across all of higher education that we're seeing, and it's something that really has to be dealt with because we've got to get to a point where everyone's data is secure and at the same level of security.
Yeah, it's sort of like a new take on the digital divide.
Absolutely, yeah, it aligns itself very well with that concept.
So, looking ahead at the coming year, what are some of the big security trends, security risks to watch in 2021?
So some of the big trends, the biggest risk to start off there is absolutely ransomware, and it will remain ransomware. When we look at what the bad guys are starting to do with ransomware and with these attacks, initially what happened was obviously with ransomware, all of your data is encrypted. You can't gain access to it, and the bad guys are effectively holding it hostage. So what people were doing to combat that is they were having really good backup plans. So they would have data that was backed up. It was offsite. It was somewhere else where it was a little bit more secure. The bad guys couldn't quite get to it. So now the bad guys are evolving their technique and they're saying, well, pay us the ransom to unencrypt. The person comes back and says, well, no, we've got a backup. We're not going to pay. And then they say, well, guess what? We made a copy of all your data. And we're going to release it all on the internet unless you pay us for this. More of an extortion type of play. And you're seeing situations where they're coming back to organizations time and again, over and over, to try and extort them. The overall cost of a ransomware event has gone from probably only about, I would say, about a year and a half ago, it was sitting at about $100,000. Now it's skyrocketed up to almost $300,000 just in the last 18 months. And that's been one of those areas that ransomware has really clipped up because they realize that people have cybersecurity insurance. The insurance company will pay. It's just easy money for them to go after. And in my opinion, it would be far better that money be going to protecting student information and instruction of students than, unfortunately, going off to fund, international criminal organizations.
Right.
Yeah.
Like a few years ago, it sounded like the messaging around IT security, at least in higher education, was, it's not about if a breach or an attack is going to occur, it's when, and just to focus more on your response as opposed to prevention. Is that still good advice, or what is the thinking now?
Unfortunately, there is a reality of that. Again, there's no such thing as a completely secure system, unfortunately. So I think that one of the things that I think will be an emerging trend is this concept of what they call zero trust, which is basically you're acting as though the old way of IT security was largely like, well, once somebody's inside the barrier, we're going to trust them a lot more. And what that would lead to is that the minute somebody can get past the barrier, then it turns into they have the ability to move. The bad guy has the ability to move around more easily, move up in privileges to do nasty things. at this point, there's more of a move to just not trust anybody and make people validate all the time, but having good mechanisms so that that doesn't become a barrier for when somebody's actually working and trying to get work done, because obviously people don't want an alert popping up every 5 minutes saying, prove who you are. That's not going to be able to do the job. So it's really aligning this concept of, well, we can't trust people the way that we used to, and by people I mean computer users, because they get their if they get their credentials breached or anything like that. And we need to be able to align that with the business case so that they can still easily do their job and do that. So that zero trust, I think, is something you're going to be hearing about quite a bit over the next few years, especially as things have opened up with remote work.
How does that mesh with, the sort of culture of openness in higher ed and the users expecting a certain experience when they're accessing systems?
And that's really what I'm getting to, is that is experience has to be preserved, or else you're going to be in a position where things are quite difficult, because the minute you make it so that it's more difficult for people to do their job, then what you've done is you've created an incentive for them to work around your security control. And so once you have to figure out a way to align that with the business. And so that's where you get a lot of technologies that are out there that set up and help run this type of thing in a way that's really at the end, it's technologically quite complex, but it's incredibly simple and transparent for the user. As a matter of fact, sometimes it ends up even actually making their life a lot easier by having only one place to sign in and managing all of that access across the board.
Would you say that the pandemic is still like a heavy impact on IT security right now, or are we past that after, now that we've kind of gotten over that initial quick change to remote learning?
I wouldn't say that it's over. I mean, it's still there. It's still in place. I mean, there's been a settling into kind of a more of a new normal kind of scenario, and so I think that has been a benefit that you're going to have there. But I think that the pandemic and the effects of it have really altered the IT landscape so much that I don't think we'll even quite figure out exactly how much it's been altered for, until we come out the other side of this, and then people start making decisions like, well, we're never going to go back to work again. We're just going to work from home, or we're going to we're going to be able to offer a lot more remote learning than we ever did before, and have the technologies in place for it. So I think as that's still yet to be determined, but at the moment it's very much everything that's going on is definitely enough to keep me busy.
um, do you have any sort of advice for higher ed institutions around sort of figuring out the coming year and their assessing their risk and managing their security?
Well, I think largely the best advice that I can give is to go out and consult with experts where you can, and be able to help understand what the actual risks are and what the landscape that you face is. A lot of times that can be something as simple as hiring somebody that's like what we would call an ethical hacker to try and breach your system, trying to figure out how to get around your security controls, and then tell you, look, you're vulnerable here, you're vulnerable here. Here are some easy ways that you can close that gap to be able to do that. That's sort of an early first step that you can do to at least identify some of the problems that are there. Beyond that, it's about going through and saying, okay, what are the things that are kind of the worst things that can happen, and what's the likelihood and impact of these things on our organization, and really trying to understand what that looks like, so that you're spending your budget and your dollars in the right direction to fix the right problems that will actually have the best impact into your security. And the spoiler I can give you there is that it's almost always, it's two-factor and multi-factor authentication is one of the things that prevents the most breaches that you'll ever see. So if the colleges or the institutions aren't using those, 100%, that should be where you're spending your money, is getting that. And it's something everyone's used to. I mean, your Facebook, your Twitter, your whatever else, they all have multi-factor now. So buying into that shouldn't be nearly as tough as it was 5 years ago. And I think that's a place to spend your dollars and to spend your effort, is to get something like that implemented.
And also, as institutions are working on their sort of emergency response plans, or even just sort of the contingency plans for the coming year in terms of what if we have to go remote again, or are we going back to campus? What would you advise in terms of incorporating IT security into those contingency plans?
Honestly, it doesn't take that much. It's really about when you practice for your worst day ever, it becomes a little easier when you have to face that day. And that's what I see repeatedly, is that organizations who just do something as simple as a tabletop of getting the right people in the room to say, okay, let's practice this. Let's say, okay, we got hit with ransomware. What are we going to do? And go through from the technical people being able to figure out, this is where it came from, this is what happened, to the PR people of, this is a prepared response that we have. This is how we would detect it. This is how we would respond to it. Going through that exercise, a lot of times it'll shake things out. And my favorite thing in those scenarios is that you'll always find out that there's one person who knows everything. And I when I'm helping to facilitate these, I usually will take 5 minutes just to prove a point, and I'll tell them to leave the room. And I'll just look at everyone else and say, now what are you going to do? Because you know what? They're not available. They're in Tahiti or wherever. And suddenly everyone gets the idea that they need to write down things a lot more than they have before, and really be able to have a formal plan that they can rely on.
I've heard a lot that the pandemic has sort of given IT a chance to make everyone write down those kinds of plans.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that it's been an opportunity for people to do that, and as long as people aren't in the scenario where they are just so busy that they can't do it. I always say that the crisis moment is the perfect moment for you to utilize that opportunity to write things down, because it's all fresh in your head. I right after the pandemic hit, when we were looking at April, May, shortly after everything started, I was telling everyone who would listen, hey, write it all down now. It's right fresh in your brain. You know exactly what you just did, and you know what worked, you know what didn't work, you know what you need to change. Write it down now before you forget, because if you're going back to the well, if you're waiting for, well, once everything is great, let's hopefully say sometime late this year. Then what's the scenario that you're at? Do you really remember what you were doing last March? Do you really remember the struggles you had then? So anything you can do to write things down sooner rather than later is absolutely a best decision that you can make.
That's really good advice. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Rhea Kelly, and this was the Campus Technology Insider Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and Stitcher, or visit us online at campustechnology.com/podcast. Let us know what you think of this episode and what you'd like to hear in the future. Until next time.